Alright, welcome back, guys. So in this video, we're now going to talk about basically how it's possible to experience some event, right, that entertains you, but come to a different conclusion. How it's possible for multiple people to experience some event that entertains them, but generally come to different conclusions about the experience or the quality or what they felt during the experience. So in other words, we're talking about opinions, right? Basically where opinions come from. Now that might not be seem like such a super important topic compared to what we're talking about, but it actually is. It's actually very important to truly understand how the subconscious works, right? Because basically, according to what we were saying in the previous videos, your subconscious has an absolute nature, right? So it responds in a certain way to your intentions. Responds a certain way to your intentions, which was determined by God and cannot be changed, right? So if that's true, right, then in theory, right, multiple people should be able to experience some event that's entertaining them, and as a result of reflection principle, they should generally all generally have the same experience, right, in terms of the emotions they felt, right? Now, there is another dimension which we haven't really talked about, which is the charging component. In theory, multiple people could see the same event, but for some reason just not charge. In other words, their subconscious can switch to the same frequency or frequencies during the event, but just not charge up in the same way. For now, we'll just kind of table that possibility. So we'll just assume that everyone's subconscious is charging in the same way. Right, because there's still more to talk about. We'll talk more about charging in the next chapter, but for now, just assume everyone's subconscious charges the same way. So, and that's true, then why can they still have different opinions? Now, I'll basically just read this first point, which is a question. So why can multiple people watch the same movie, or listen to the same joke, or listen to the same song, or play the same video game, read the same book, listen to the same conversation, or listen to a person telling a story in a conversation? Why can they all do that, but still generally come to different conclusions? Generally come to different conclusions about the quality of the experience, right? Or more specifically, why can they all experience different emotions? Well, there are two main reasons, right? So this is kind of a smaller reason, which is kind of an extension of this reason, but I should say there's one main reason, but this is still something that can happen that's worth mentioning, which we kind of talked about it before. But the first reason is that the abstract component of the intention that they're producing, right, does not accurately reflect the context the creator intended, usually due to missing information. So in other words, what I'm really saying there is that, let's say you're listening to a joke, right? Let's say I make a joke about, let's say I make it about a random person. Let's say Trump, right? Let's say I'm making a joke about Donald Trump. Now, let's say you never heard of Donald Trump. You don't know who he is. You don't know who I'm talking about, right? If I make a joke, right, then in order for the reflection process to happen, well, as the reflection process is happening, right, so you're producing an intention that's reflecting or copying what I'm saying, right, the concrete component, right, you get for free, so you're just going to copy whatever information's coming from your five senses, you're going to copy that in your mind. But the abstract component isn't free, right? So your conscious mind is going to try to make sense of what I'm saying and what's going on. And it's going to produce, the abstract command component is going to copy or express itself in a way that's meant to copy what I'm saying, right? But it's going to sometimes fill in the blanks, right? And if you don't know who Donald Trump is, you're not going to be able to fill in the blanks. So your information is going to be missing. So the intention you produce as you reflect or copy the joke I'm saying, it might not properly get your subconscious to switch to the laughter frequency, right? As a result. Now, for people who do have that inside information, right, who do actually know who Donald Trump is, if I make a certain joke, they might laugh because the abstract component of their intention does properly fill in the blank, right? So that's one reason why that can happen. So the person who doesn't know who Donald Trump is obviously going to have a very different experience listening to my joke from someone who does, right? And so that they would have different opinions about the quality of the joke. And even if we know who Donald Trump is, there's different layers of that inside information. Maybe they know something about him that I know, or maybe I know something about him that the other person doesn't know, and some other people do, and maybe some other people have varying degrees of that information. So this can occur on different scales. So as you can see, it still results in the end in different opinions and experiences about the joke. So that's one reason. But the main reason ultimately is this point right here, which I'll read off. So it says, the main reason is the way a pre-existing charge alters the perception of the conscious mind and disrupts the accuracy of the reflection process. So actually, even before I get to this point, let me go back here, because there's something I just remembered. Something I wanted to say. Another example of this has to do with movies, right? So Mario, I forget what the full title of the movie was, but Mario, right? So Mario, the recent movie, well, recent from the time of this video, Nintendo made a Mario movie, which was actually, I thought it was really good, because it reminded me of a whole bunch of things that I remember playing, a whole bunch of Mario games that I remember playing when I was a kid. And a lot of critics were saying that the movie was terrible and it was bad and this and that. And I was like, it was annoying, because it was like, no, it wasn't, right? Did the movie miss some aspects of what you might say makes a good story? Kind of. But it made up for it in other ways. It made up for it with the nostalgia, right? So they did so many things right in terms of accurately reflecting the video games. And that created a huge emotional response. So it created an emotional response for me and everyone else who pretty much grew up playing Mario games. And so that was actually reflected in the reviews. So the audience had a completely different reaction than many of the critics, right? Because the critics aren't acknowledging all the different components of what makes something entertaining, right? Because they have a very fixed opinion on what makes something good, which doesn't actually obey the rules of the subconscious mind. So that was actually, I think the critics actually lost a lot of credibility with that movie. Like, I noticed that on this website, the reviews actually started going up for Mario when there was so much backlash, because they knew they were wrong, right? So in other words, so that's just a good example, right? So if you don't have inside information, or if you're just ignoring it like they were, right, you're not going to properly be able to describe the experience, or your experience is going to be very different from someone who has that inside information. Because remember what I said, entertainment is based on how much emotion you feel, or how much your subconscious is charging some positive or semi-positive frequency. So in the case of Mario, because they did so many other things right that created that nostalgia, it helped to charge people's subconscious who were watching it, and they were entertained, right? So regardless of what you think is missing from a story, right, what does it matter if a person is still entertained and enjoying themselves? That's why the reviews from the audience were so different from the reviews of the critics, right? And it showed you that the reviews of the critics is a very small facet, or at least it's not a complete facet of the criteria that should go into judging what makes a movie good, right? Which made no sense. As you can see, right, because we're actually studying the subconscious, you're going to have a much better understanding of what that criteria should be. So anyway, I thought that was important enough to mention. But going back to this point, I'll just read it again because I went off on another thing. So the main reason for differences in opinions is ultimately the way a pre-existing charge alters the perception of the conscious mind and disrupts the accuracy of the reflection process. Which technically, this, like I said before, I don't know if I said it already, but this is kind of an extension of this principle. So we're going to look at this principle though. Because let's say, so there's another example. Let's say you're listening to a joke, right? You're listening to a joke, but you're very, very, very angry, right? So you're seeing red, you're seething, right? There's like smoke coming out of your ears. You're pissed off about something, right? Now, when you do that, if you're feeling all that, then that means your subconscious is charged up at the anger frequency, right? It's charged up at the anger frequency and it's altering your perception, right? Now, because it's doing that, it's going to be hard for you to perceive some joke in the proper context, right? Because remember, context, the evolution of the context, which is just a story, those act as commands to your subconscious. That would be a command that tells, let's say I'm telling a joke, which has a setup, which is part of the story, and the punchline. Let's say I'm telling that, a joke with that format. As I'm saying it, that's meant to be the story that commands your subconscious through the reflection principle to switch to the laughter frequency at some point. But if you're very, very angry, right, your perception's altered where you're not going to perceive the context properly to get that command out of it, right? And so the joke is going to be missed, or it's going to be wasted on you. But you're going to miss it, right? So you're not going to understand the joke properly because you're so angry. Right? So if someone makes a joke while you're angry, in other words, it's going to be hard to laugh. You know what I mean? But more specifically, it's going to be hard to even perceive the joke as a joke, right? It's just going to be a series of words. You know what I mean? And so the context won't be there. And so so a pre-existing charge actually affects how well, or it actually affects how the reflection process works, in other words. Right, it reflects how well the reflection process occurs, or how accurately it occurs, right? So, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So there's not really much else to say, but yeah, basically, the pre-existing charge alters the reflection process or disrupts it. So your subconscious just doesn't charge as well, right? It doesn't charge in the way it's generally supposed to. When you're observing some event that's meant to entertain you, right? And just to kind of go over even a little more of what's going on is when you charge your subconscious, right? Let's say you charge it at the anger frequency. It takes a while for that energy to discharge, right? So it's going to stick around a while. And as long as it's sticking around, it's going to alter your perception and influence the way you think. And like we said before, entertainment is... we basically described it as a state where you're charging up a positive or semi-positive frequency, or you're doing that while engaged in some entertaining activity. Now, every positive frequency is antithetical to every negative frequency, so it's going to be even harder for you to be entertained while you're angry. So obviously, the anger is going to disrupt the reflection process as it relates to being entertained. So that is the beginning of the answer, right? Of where different opinions come from. So if someone's angry or in a bad mood, right, they're not going to find something as entertaining or funny as someone else who doesn't have that mood. But ultimately, there is a deeper answer than that. That is the beginning of the answer. But what I want to talk about in the next couple videos is more of a abstract answer, right? So we're going to start talking about something called subconscious forms, which that comes from the concept of forms from Plato or Socrates. And I know that might seem a bit strange, right? But it's actually important because what he was talking about, what Socrates and Plato were talking about, I think are actually what we're going to talk about later, which are called subconscious forms, and they're actually very, very important to understanding the subconscious mind. So, and I'll go into it in the next couple of videos, but so yeah, it might be a lot. I had to rewrite this section in the book. Like, I actually rewrote chapter 7. I rewrote this whole chapter probably like 7 or 8 times because I kept trying to make it clearer and clearer, right? Because it's so abstract, it's a bit difficult to explain these things, these ideas. Like I said, to me, I'm used to abstract stuff. Been that way my whole life, so it's not that big a problem for me. But I want to make sure I'm explaining it correctly. So, yeah, the next couple of videos might be a little tough because they're so abstract. But like I said, if you can understand them, then you're going to have a much better understanding of the subconscious, and especially as it relates to creativity. This is actually the reason why I didn't want to talk too much about subconscious organization yet, because we haven't spoken about subconscious forms, which those are important in understanding how creativity works, and also important in understanding where different opinions come from, right? Which basically makes sense because people might disagree on how creative something is. And by doing that, what's really happening is they're having different opinions about it. So we have to understand this, and then that'll help us to understand the true nature of creativity, right? So, in the next video, we're going to talk about, we're basically going to do a recap. So if you haven't learned about forms in philosophy class from Plato, I never know whether it's Plato or Socrates. I know Plato was the student of Socrates, but I'm pretty sure Socrates believed in forms too, but then Plato was the one that actually wrote about them. So I don't know. Anyway, I'll probably use them interchangeably, even though I know they're different people. But we're going to talk about forms in antiquity. So we're going to talk about forms from ancient Greece, Western philosophy. We're going to talk about how Socrates defined them. And then we're going to go back to the subconscious in another video and start talking about subconscious forms. All right. So yeah, that's it for this video. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.